As you would expect, programming in the early days of video gaming was extremely simple. One of the first commercial video games, Pong, is so simple by today's standards that it can be programmed using C++ with hardly more than 100 lines of code. In fact, it's so simple that it doesn't even require software programming at all. It can even be played entirely on hardware, as shown here being played on an oscilloscope and some external hardware. However, if you look at the programming in the C++ version, you'll see some familiar statements, namely if and else. Basically, the position of the ball is constantly being tracked, and the programming works as follows. If the ball contacts a paddle, reverse its direction. Else, if it misses, add 1 point to the other player's score and restart the ball in the middle of the screen. This program will then loop until one player's score reaches a certain level, and it will print a message to declare that person the winner. Around the same time that Pong was released, text adventure games started being developed. A popular example of this genre was 1984's video game adaptation of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. By this point, video games were being made using game engines, so the programmers wouldn't have to write all the code from scratch, but it still comes down to simple if and then statements. The program will scan the input text, and if certain conditions are met, will output an appropriate response. Else, if the program doesn't understand the input, it will give a generic response implying that the input is invalid. This is essentially the entire game, with different options becoming available as different conditions are met, such as location or contents of inventory. As adventure games grew more sophisticated and added graphics, the programming grew more sophisticated in turn, yet the basics remained the same. King's Quest, released in 1984, was an early example of a text-based graphic adventure game, but despite the obvious change in interface, the mechanics essentially remained the same. Take for example this interaction with the goat. The goat will move randomly from one screen to another. If the goat is on the displayed screen, and if Graham is inside the pen, and if the carrot is in his inventory, entering "show carrot" will prompt the goat to follow you. Else, if any of these conditions are not met, a generic response will be displayed, implying that this function cannot be performed. When Maniac Mansion was released in 1987, it was one of the first games known as a point-and-click adventure game, taking advantage of the mouse, which was still relatively new to the mainstream. Although the input was different, the programming was, once again, very similar. The engine, known as SCUM, or Script Creation Utility, for Maniac Mansion, took input from the mouse to select one of 15 options from the screen, and then an object or person to perform it on. As usual, if the conditions were met, the game would respond accordingly. The SCUM engine was used in other games for several years beyond Maniac Mansion, and although it is now obsolete, you can still recognize the same core programming in games today.